The sound of the bell ringing signaled the end of another uneventful class at Jefferson High. Ethan Carter, a 16-year-old with dreams bigger than the world he lived in, packed his books into his bag, his fingers subconsciously tapping the rhythm of a song on the cover. His mind, however, was elsewhere, back at the piano in his small, dimly lit room at home. That piano was his escape, his solace, the place where nothing else mattered. His fingers would glide across the keys, bringing the melodies of Chopin and Beethoven to life, as if he were somewhere else entirely. But today, there was a nagging feeling gnawing at the back of his mind as he slung his backpack over his shoulder. Mrs. Collins, his music teacher, had been on his case for weeks. She wasn't the typical teacher, gruff, critical, and often dismissive of anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of success. She had that air about her, perfectionist, elitist, and more than a little racist. Ethan had long sensed that she didn't think much of him, but today, it would become all too clear. As the class stood to leave, Mrs. Collins called out to him, her voice cold and sharp. "Ethan, stay for a moment." The room emptied, and Ethan hesitated, feeling the weight of her words before even stepping toward her desk. The usual murmur of students heading out the door seemed distant, as if time had slowed down just for him. His heart raced as he walked towards her, feeling the harsh glare of her eyes. "You think you belong in the advanced class, don't you?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "Well, let me tell you something, Carter. The best music schools don't take kids like you. You may think you have talent, but you'll never be able to compete with the real musicians. You're just wasting everyone's time, including your own." Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Mrs. Collins' words cut deeper than he cared to admit. He had never been good at confrontation, and he didn't know how to respond to her venom. The other students had already filed out of the room, leaving Ethan alone to face her. The classroom felt like a suffocating box, the walls closing in around him. His hands clenched at his sides, a surge of anger bubbling up inside him. But what could he say? He had no proof. She was the teacher, the one who could make or break his future in music. And she had already made it clear she had no faith in him. Ethan wanted to defend himself, to shout out, but the words wouldn't come. His chest tightened, and for a moment, all he could hear was the beating of his own heart. The woman in front of him had always been hard on everyone, but today felt different. There was a venom in her tone that he had never heard before, and it stung. "You'll never get into Juilliard, or any of the other top schools," Mrs. Collins continued, her voice colder now. "You should be realistic, Carter. Focus on something you can actually achieve. The piano isn't your future." A lump formed in Ethan's throat, and he felt the sudden urge to run. The one thing he had held on to, his music, his escape, was now being torn down before his eyes. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "Don't be disappointed when you don't get into those schools. Maybe you should stick to something more manageable," she said with a dismissive flick of her wrist, as though the conversation were already over. Without another word, she turned her attention to the stack of papers on her desk, effectively dismissing him. Ethan stood there for a moment, frozen in place. His mind raced. How could she say that? How could she undermine everything he'd worked for? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ethan didn't know how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts. The room felt colder now, the light dimming in the afternoon haze outside the window. For a brief moment, it was as though the world around him had stopped. But he couldn't stand there forever. He had to move. His legs felt like lead as he slowly walked out of the classroom, his mind reeling. Mrs. Collins' words echoed in his ears, relentless, unyielding. "You'll never be good enough. You're wasting your time." Ethan wasn't sure where to go. He could feel the weight of the entire school pressing down on him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt small. As he passed the rows of lockers, he heard the laughter of his classmates, the chatter of students heading to their next classes. It felt distant, foreign, as if he were watching the world from behind a glass wall. He made his way to the music room, hoping to find some solace in the one place he felt at home. When he opened the door, the familiar smell of polished wood and sheet music greeted him, but it did little to ease the ache in his chest. Ethan walked to the piano in the corner and sat down, his fingers resting on the keys. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music settle him. But as he began to play, the melody was disjointed, his mind far away. Mrs. Collins' cruel words kept intruding. The best music schools don't take kids like you. You'll never be good enough. He wanted to prove her wrong. He wanted to show her, to show everyone, that he was more than her dismissive judgment. He had the talent, he had the drive. All he needed was the opportunity. But the thought of her scoffing at him, the way she'd looked at him like he was a joke, it was all he could see now. Ethan took a deep breath, his fingers trembling slightly on the keys. He had a choice. He could let her win, let her words define him, or he could fight. What would you do if you lost everything and felt like no one believed in you? Tyler, his best friend, would tell him to keep going. Tyler always did. It's not about them, man, Tyler had said once, it's about what you believe. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. And maybe Tyler was right. Maybe Mrs. Collins didn't define his future. Ethan had to find a way to prove it to himself, no one else mattered. As the sound of the piano filled the room, Ethan's resolve began to harden. He would prove her wrong. He would show her, and everyone else, that he was more than they thought. And this was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ethan sat at his desk in the dimly lit room, staring at the piano across from him. His fingers itched to touch the keys, to let the music flow through him as it always had. But today, his mind was heavy. Mrs. Collins' words echoed in his head like a constant, buzzing hum. You'll never be good enough, she had said. The best music schools don't take kids like you. He had always known that people like him didn't always get the same chances as others. It was something he'd grown up with, an invisible wall built by society, separating people like him from the opportunities that others took for granted. Ethan was black. And in a world where doors were often closed to those who didn't fit the traditional mold, Ethan had always felt like an outsider. But that didn't mean he was going to give up on his dreams. Ethan's mind drifted back to his childhood. He had always loved music. It was the one thing that had never failed him. His mother, Maria, had made sure he had access to a piano when he was young, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort. She had seen the spark in him early on, her son, who seemed to lose himself in the music, who played as if he could feel every note deep in his soul. Maria wasn't a musician herself, but she had an incredible ear. She recognized Ethan's talent long before anyone else did. The way his small fingers would strike the keys, creating melodies that felt older than his years. The way he could listen to a song once and immediately replicate it on the piano. It was a gift. But life hadn't always been easy for Maria and Ethan. She was a single mother, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Their apartment wasn't much, just 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a small living area. But Maria always made sure Ethan had what he needed. She worked long hours as a waitress and a cashier, barely sleeping, but always managing to smile when she came home. Music can take you places, Ethan, she would say as she tucked him in at night. It's the one thing that no one can ever take away from you. Don't forget that. Ethan had never forgotten those words. They were his guiding light, the reason he fought so hard for his dream of becoming a professional pianist. But now, with Mrs. Collins' harsh judgment weighing on him, he felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. His younger sister, Maya, was the other constant in his life. She looked up to him, following him around like a shadow, always eager to hear him play. Maya wasn't old enough to understand the complexities of race or the struggles their family faced, but she understood Ethan's music. She loved it, and she loved him for sharing it with her. "Ethan, are you playing tonight?" Maya asked, poking her head around the corner of his room. Ethan glanced over at her, offering a small smile. Maya's face was full of curiosity and excitement. She was just 8 years old, but she had a deep love for music too. Ethan had taught her a few simple songs on the piano, and she loved to sing along as he played. Her voice was sweet, and though it wasn't perfect, it was always full of heart. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice quieter than usual. "Just trying to work something out." Maya walked into the room, climbing onto the small chair beside him. "Play that song you played last time, the one that made Mom smile." Ethan chuckled softly and nodded. He played the opening chords of the song, a simple, joyful piece that had always made Maria's eyes light up. It was a song of hope, of resilience, and of the love that bound their family together. Maya joined in, humming along with the melody, her voice blending with his as though they were one. As he played, Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but for a moment, it lifted. Music had always been his sanctuary, the place where he could be free from the harsh realities of life. It was the one thing that never let him down. "I'm gonna be the best," he whispered to himself as he played. "I have to be." But as the song finished, a sense of unease settled over him again. He couldn't escape the feeling that he wasn't enough. Mrs. Collins' words haunted him, and the pressure of trying to live up to her expectations, and everyone else's, felt unbearable. "Hey, Ethan." Maya's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. He turned to look at her, noticing the concern in her wide eyes. "What's up? You okay?" she asked, her voice small. Ethan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just thinking." Maya nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. "You don't have to be perfect all the time, you know." Ethan's heart clenched. He hadn't realized until that moment just how much pressure he was putting on himself. Maya was right. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be himself. And no matter what Mrs. Collins said, he knew that the music was inside him. It had always been there. No one could take that away. "Thanks, Maya," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. He pulled her into a quick hug, kissing the top of her head. "You're the best." Maya beamed, her face lighting up. "I know." Ethan couldn't help but laugh. She always knew how to make him feel better, even when things seemed impossible. It was moments like these, moments with his family, that reminded him of why he was pushing so hard to succeed. He wanted to give them a better life. He wanted to make his mom proud, to show her that all of her sacrifices were worth it. And he wanted to prove to himself that he could be something more than what people like Mrs. Collins believed he could be. After a few more minutes of playing, Ethan stood up from the piano, determination filling his chest. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would have to face more people like Mrs. Collins, people who doubted him and made him feel like an outsider. But he would keep going. He had to. "Tomorrow, I'm going to prove her wrong," he muttered to himself, the words feeling like a promise. As Ethan turned off the piano, he knew that the journey would be long. There would be more challenges, more doubts, and more people who would try to break him. But he wasn't going to let them. He had something they didn't, a fire inside him that couldn't be extinguished. Tomorrow was the first step. And he was ready. The next day at Jefferson High felt different. Ethan could sense it even before he stepped into the music classroom. The air was charged with something he couldn't quite put his finger on, a tension that made his palms sweat as he walked down the hall. He had no idea what Mrs. Collins would do next, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. As he pushed open the door to the music room, the familiar scent of wood polish and sheet music filled his nose. It felt like home, but today it seemed colder, more distant. Mrs. Collins was already standing at the front of the room, her arms crossed, scanning the room with a sharp gaze. She barely acknowledged Ethan's entrance, as if he was just another face in the crowd. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Collins said, her voice clipped. "Today's lesson is going to be a little different. We're going to test your skills. I've selected a few pieces, and you'll be performing them in front of the class. This will be the first step in determining who belongs in the advanced class." Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. The advanced class. It was where he wanted to be, where he needed to be, but it wasn't going to be easy. Mrs. Collins had made it clear that she didn't believe he belonged there, and he had a sinking feeling that today's test would be another attempt to show him that he wasn't good enough. He took his seat in the middle of the room, trying to focus on the music in front of him. The pieces she had chosen weren't easy. They were complex, intricate, and required the kind of skill that most advanced pianists spent years perfecting. Ethan had practiced these pieces for weeks, but he still felt the weight of Mrs. Collins' judgment hanging over him. It was as if the moment he touched the keys, she would find a way to tear him down. "Let's start with you, Ethan," Mrs. Collins said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Play the Chopin Nocturne in E-flat major. Show us what you've got." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The Chopin Nocturne was one of the most challenging pieces in classical music, but it was also one of his favorites. He had spent hours practicing it, trying to get every note just right. But facing Mrs. Collins, the woman who had already written him off, made it feel like the world was crashing down on him. He walked up to the piano, trying to steady his breath. His hands shook as he sat down, the cool keys beneath his fingers grounding him for a moment. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound of Mrs. Collins' sharp gaze and the hushed whispers of his classmates. All he could do was focus on the music. He had to. As his fingers moved over the keys, the soft, melancholic melody filled the room. It was a piece full of emotion, a piece that spoke to his soul. The music wrapped around him, pushing out all the doubt, all the fear. He let the notes flow, feeling the rhythm in his bones. This was his moment. He couldn't let Mrs. Collins, or anyone, take it away from him. The longer he played, the more he felt himself sinking into the music. It wasn't perfect. His timing was a little off in some spots, and a few notes didn't come out quite the way he wanted. But it was raw, it was real, and it was his. When he finished, there was a long silence. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for Mrs. Collins' verdict. He could feel the eyes of the class on him, their judgment hanging in the air like a thick fog. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Well," Mrs. Collins finally said, her voice as cold as ever, "that was acceptable." Ethan's heart sank. Acceptable? That was the best she could offer after everything he had put into that performance. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough for her. He knew it, and she knew it. The harsh tone in her voice made it clear that no matter how hard he tried, it would never be good enough for someone like her. "Next," Mrs. Collins said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. Ethan slowly stood up, his mind swirling with frustration and anger. He wanted to shout, to throw the piano bench across the room and scream at her to recognize his talent. But instead, he walked back to his seat, his shoulders hunched in defeat. The rest of the class performed one by one, each taking their turn at the piano. Some played flawlessly, while others struggled, just as Ethan had. But through it all, Mrs. Collins remained distant, cold, her eyes always critical, as if she were waiting for someone to fail. As the last student finished, Mrs. Collins looked around the room, her eyes briefly meeting Ethan's. There was no smile, no acknowledgement, just the same disapproving look. She wasn't impressed. And in that moment, he realized something: he could spend his whole life trying to win her approval, and it would never happen. She had already made up her mind about him. But he wasn't doing this for her. He wasn't doing it for anyone but himself. "Well," Mrs. Collins said, Turning to the class, I'll make my final decision on who belongs in the advanced class by the end of the week. In the meantime, keep practicing. Ethan didn't wait for the bell to ring. He grabbed his bag and walked out of the room, his head spinning. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let Mrs. Collins' judgment control him. He couldn't let her or anyone else decide his worth. As he walked down the hallway, his mind raced with thoughts of the future. He had to keep going. He had to get better, prove them wrong, and show them what he was capable of. Because deep down, he knew he was more than just the kid they thought he was. He would never let them break him. He would fight until the end. The week dragged on, every minute weighed down by the tension from Mrs. Collins' test. Ethan tried to push it from his mind, tried to focus on the music, but every time he sat down at the piano, he could feel the judgment creeping in. Her words, her disapproving glances, they clung to him like a shadow, no matter where he went. It was Thursday when it happened. Ethan was in the music room, practicing his scales, trying to keep his hands steady. The music should have been an escape, but it was becoming harder to focus. His mind kept returning to that moment when he played for the class, when Mrs. Collins had dismissed him so easily. Acceptable. It echoed in his head like a hollow drumbeat, haunting him. Mr. Carter. The voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and commanding. He turned to see Mrs. Collins standing at the door, her arms crossed, her gaze piercing. He was used to her cold demeanor, but today, there was something different in her eyes, something almost predatory. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice like steel. Ethan swallowed hard but nodded. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach, like the ground was shifting beneath him. He knew what was coming. It had been coming all week. Mrs. Collins was going to tell him he didn't belong. She was going to tell him that no matter how hard he tried, he wasn't good enough. He stood up and walked over to her, trying to keep his face neutral. He didn't want to show her that she had gotten under his skin, but it was hard to hide the anxiety gnawing at his insides. "Sit down," she instructed, pointing to a chair beside her desk. Ethan obeyed, his palms clammy as he sat. His mind raced. What was she going to say? What did she want from him? Mrs. Collins didn't speak immediately. She stared at him, as if studying him. There was something about the way she looked at him, cold, calculating, that made his skin crawl. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I've been watching you, Ethan," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You're talented, I'll give you that. But you're not great. Not like the others. You think you deserve a spot in the advanced class, but you're just not there yet." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had expected criticism, but hearing it so bluntly, so coldly, made it hit harder than he had imagined. He clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to argue, to shout at her that she didn't understand. "You're not like the other students in this class," Mrs. Collins continued. "They have discipline. They have focus. They don't waste time making excuses. She paused, as if searching for the right words. "You've got potential, but you're too caught up in your own head. And that's what's holding you back." Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The words lodged in his throat like shards of glass. It was hard to breathe, hard to think. All he could hear was Mrs. Collins' voice telling him he wasn't enough. He had worked so hard, given everything he had to this, and it was still never going to be enough. "What I'm saying," she went on, "is that you need to decide if you really want this. Because if you do, you have to give it everything. Otherwise, you'll just be another student who had a dream but couldn't make it." Ethan stared at her, his mind spinning. Another student who couldn't make it. He had heard those words before, from people who thought they knew what he was capable of, from people who thought they could decide his future for him. But this was Mrs. Collins. His music teacher. The one person who was supposed to help him, guide him, believe in him. "Don't you get it?" Mrs. Collins snapped, her patience thinning. "You're wasting your time. You're wasting my time." Ethan felt his chest tighten, his hands curling into fists. It took everything in him to keep from standing up and walking out. But he couldn't. Not yet. He looked at Mrs. Collins, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not wasting your time. I'm doing this for me. And I will make it. You'll see." Mrs. Collins' lips twisted into a mocking smile. "We'll see, Mr. Carter. We'll see." She turned sharply and walked out of the room, leaving Ethan sitting there, stunned. The silence that followed was suffocating. He could hear the echo of her words bouncing off the walls, each one a jagged knife lodged in his chest. Ethan's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the piano. Not good enough. Wasting time. The words spiraled in his mind like a whirlwind. For a moment, he wondered if she was right. Maybe he wasn't good enough. Maybe all his practice, all his sacrifice, meant nothing. But then something shifted. He remembered the way his mother had looked at him when he played, the pride in her eyes. He remembered Maya's voice, telling him that he didn't have to be perfect. He remembered the music, the way it felt when it flowed through him, the way it made him feel alive. Ethan stood up, wiping the sweat from his palms. He couldn't let Mrs. Collins break him. He couldn't let anyone do that. He had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. He walked to the piano, sitting down once more. The keys were still cold under his fingers, but this time, he didn't hesitate. He started playing, pouring everything he had into the music. Every ounce of frustration, every ounce of pain, flowed through his fingertips as he played the piece with more passion than he ever had before. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let anyone tell him what he could or couldn't do. He was going to prove them all wrong. Mrs. Collins had made a mistake. He wasn't just another student. He was Ethan Carter, and he was going to make it. No matter what. The next day felt like an uphill battle. Ethan couldn't shake the conversation with Mrs. Collins from his mind. He had spent hours practicing the Chopin Nocturne and another piece Mrs. Collins had given him, but no matter how many times he tried, his thoughts kept returning to her harsh words. He walked through the halls of Jefferson High, the weight of Mrs. Collins' dismissal pressing on his chest like a heavy stone. Every step felt like it carried the burden of doubt, every echo of his footsteps a reminder of how far he still had to go. But today, something inside him was different. He wasn't going to let her define him. He wasn't going to be the person who let a single critic break him. He had come too far to let someone who didn't even understand his journey tear him down. When Ethan entered the music room, he was met with a tense silence. Mrs. Collins was at the front of the class, reviewing some sheet music with the students. Her gaze briefly flicked over to Ethan, and he could almost feel the judgment in her eyes. But he refused to let it affect him. He sat at the piano, not waiting for her instruction, but focusing on himself. As the bell rang, signaling the start of class, Mrs. Collins turned to face the students. "Today," she said, "we're going to try something different. I want you all to play something you've worked on independently. Something you feel passionate about. We'll start with you, Ethan." Ethan stiffened at the mention of his name. He had expected her to dismiss him again, to tell him that he didn't belong in the class or give him another impossible piece to prove his worth. But this was different. She was giving him a chance. A real chance. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat and stood. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he walked confidently to the piano, sitting down. He felt the familiar coldness of the keys beneath his fingers, but this time, he wasn't afraid. He began to play a piece he had been working on for weeks, a song that spoke to him in a way few other pieces did. It was a composition of his own, a mix of classical and jazz influences that told a story of struggle, hope, and triumph. The notes spilled from his fingers effortlessly, as though they had always been inside him, waiting to be released. As he played, he let go of the anxiety that had been building inside him for weeks. He played as if no one else was in the room, as if it was just him and the music. Every note was an expression of everything he had been through, his family's struggles, his dreams, the fire inside him that refused to die no matter how many times life tried to put it out. The music grew more intense, faster, and louder. Ethan could feel the rhythm in his chest, his heart matching the beats. The class was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on him. He felt the weight of their gaze, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter what they thought. He played for himself. He played to prove to Mrs. Collins, to everyone who had ever doubted him, that he was capable of greatness. When the final note rang out, the room was still. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ethan's breath came in heavy gasps as he slowly lifted his hands from the keys, waiting for Mrs. Collins' judgment. Then, something surprising happened. Mrs. Collins stood frozen, her eyes wide, her lips parted as if she had been caught off guard. The rest of the class remained silent as well, as if they were waiting for her reaction. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. He had no idea what she was thinking. Was it good? Was it terrible? He couldn't tell. Finally, Mrs. Collins cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than usual, though still firm. Ethan, that was. She paused, then looked directly at him. Impressive. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. She had said impressive. For the first time, there was something more than indifference in her eyes. There was acknowledgement, maybe even a little respect. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if everyone had been holding their breath. Ethan's heart raced, but this time it was a rush of hope, not anxiety. He had done it. He had shown them. He had shown her. Mrs. Collins took a step forward. I've been teaching for years, she said, her tone now calmer, more reflective. And I've seen a lot of students, but there's something different about you, Ethan. You're not just playing the notes. You're telling a story. Ethan felt a small smile tug at the corner of his lips. Telling a story. It was exactly what he had hoped for, what he had always wanted. His music wasn't just about technical skill, it was about emotion, about connection. Mrs. Collins nodded to herself, still looking at him with a mixture of surprise and something else, something that could almost be pride. That's what it takes to stand out in the world of music. The passion. The fire. You have it, but you need to keep working at it. Keep pushing yourself. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He just nodded, his mind racing. Mrs. Collins had never spoken to him like this before. It was a side of her that he had never seen, one that saw him for more than just a student who wasn't good enough. Class, Mrs. Collins said, turning her attention back to the rest of the students. Take notes. Ethan has just shown you what it means to play with heart. Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He had done it. He had made it past the first hurdle. He hadn't been perfect, but he had shown his true self. He wasn't just the kid from the wrong side of town. He wasn't just someone who might never make it. He was Ethan Carter, and he was more than enough. As the class continued, Ethan sat back at the piano, his fingers itching to play more. Mrs. Collins had given him a new challenge, to keep pushing himself. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, Ethan felt like he had a real shot at proving himself. He wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, stand in his way. It was late on a Friday afternoon when Ethan received an unexpected email that would change everything. He had just finished practice, his hands sore but satisfied after hours of playing through different pieces, refining his technique. He had been on a high since Mrs. Collins' reaction to his performance earlier in the week. For the first time, he felt like he was being seen, not just for his talent, but for his passion. The weight on his shoulders had lightened, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could make it in the advanced class. That he was worthy of it. He sat down at the desk in his room, running his fingers through his hair, staring at the keys of his laptop. With a tired sigh, he opened his inbox and scanned through the usual flood of spam and notifications. That's when something caught his eye: Jefferson High Advanced Music Class, Placement Announcement. Ethan's stomach flipped. His heart hammered in his chest as he opened the email. He could hardly breathe, feeling his pulse quicken as his eyes scanned the words. There, in the body of the email, were the names of the students who had made it into the advanced class for the next semester. His hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. He scanned the list, every name an agonizing blur of hopes and fears. And then, his name appeared, bolded at the top. Ethan Carter. He blinked. And blinked again. For a moment, it didn't feel real. He had made it. After everything, after all the struggles, doubts, and Mrs. Collins' harsh judgments, he had done it. He had been accepted into the advanced class. A wave of disbelief washed over him, followed by a flood of emotions. The validation he had craved, the proof that he was more than what Mrs. Collins had thought, was right in front of him. But in the back of his mind, a part of him still couldn't quite believe it. He had earned this. But had he really proven himself to everyone? Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, running his fingers through his hair as he stared at the screen, trying to process the news. But that's when a follow-up message arrived, a second email with the subject line, "A message from Mrs. Collins." His stomach clenched, and a sudden unease flooded over him. He clicked it open, the message quick to appear in his inbox. Ethan. I just wanted to personally inform you of the placement results, which were finalized earlier today. While I did select you for the advanced class, I must be clear, this is not a free pass. You still have a lot of work to do. I'm glad to see you push past your limits, but remember, you're still a long way from mastering the craft. If you want to stay in the advanced class, you will need to prove yourself every day. This is not for the faint of heart, and I expect nothing less than complete dedication. Best. Mrs. Collins. Ethan stared at the screen in silence. Her words were sharp, blunt, almost cold. He had made it into the class, yes, but the reality of it was so much more than just being accepted. It was clear now that Mrs. Collins wasn't going to cut him any slack. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. The notification on his phone buzzed, distracting him from the coldness of Mrs. Collins' message. It was Maya. Hey. I heard the news. You made it, right? Ethan smiled as he typed out a quick response. Yeah. I still can't believe it. Told you. I knew you had it in you. You're going to crush it. No one's stopping you now. Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Maya's words felt like a lifeline. It was nice to have someone who believed in him, especially when Mrs. Collins seemed determined to make him feel like he was still on trial. As he closed his laptop, the weight of the next few months settled over him. He had been accepted into the advanced class, but that didn't mean the fight was over. In fact, it had only just begun. The following Monday, Ethan walked into the music room with a new sense of purpose. His heart was still pounding from the excitement of making it into the advanced class, but there was also an undercurrent of nervous energy. Mrs. Collins had warned him that nothing was handed to him, and the pressure to prove himself was greater than ever. The class was already seated when he entered. Mrs. Collins stood at the front of the room, writing something on the whiteboard. As he walked to his usual seat, she didn't acknowledge him, but her sharp eyes followed his every movement, as if waiting for him to slip up. Today, we're going to start with something different, Mrs. Collins said, looking around at the class with her usual cold demeanor. You all made it into the advanced class for a reason. But that reason isn't enough to keep you here. From this moment forward, I will push each of you until you reach your limits. Some of you will crack under the pressure. Some of you will rise to the challenge. But only those who are truly dedicated will make it. Ethan's stomach tightened as Mrs. Collins locked eyes with him. She didn't speak his name, but he could feel her gaze, heavy, judgmental, and assessing. He had to prove himself now more than ever. I expect you all to prepare a new piece by next week. It's a piece that will test your ability to push beyond your comfort zone. I don't want to hear perfection, I want to hear growth. Ethan clenched his fists beneath the desk, his heart pounding. It was like she had already decided to make him prove himself to her every day. But it wasn't her approval he was seeking anymore. It was his own. As the class started practicing, Ethan sat at the piano, his fingers trembling slightly. The challenge had been set. He wasn't just going to meet it, he was going to surpass it. Ethan had barely slept that night. Mrs. Collins' words about proving himself, about growth, echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. The new challenge she had set in front of the class was daunting. It wasn't just a piece of music, it was a test of everything he had, a proving ground for his skill and his resolve. He had worked so hard to get here, but now the stakes felt higher than ever. By Tuesday, Ethan found himself at the piano once more, his fingers lightly brushing over the keys, though his mind was racing. Mrs. Collins had assigned a piece by Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2. It was a beast of a piece, full of intricacies and emotional depth that left little room for error. Ethan knew it was going to push him to his limit, but that was the point, right? To be pushed, to test the boundaries of his skill. He sat there, feeling the weight of the music press down on him. Rachmaninoff's piano concertos were legendary, the sort of pieces reserved for those who had mastered the piano, those who could interpret its complexities and express the soul of the music. And yet, Mrs. Collins had given it to him. Had she made a mistake? Was she hoping he'd fail? Or did she think he had it in him to truly conquer this beast of a composition? Ethan shook his head, trying to push aside the doubts that had begun to creep in. No matter what Mrs. Collins thought, no matter how daunting the piece, he had to prove to himself that he could do this. If he could master Piano Concerto No. 2, he would be unstoppable. The next few days were a blur of practice, each session harder than the last. Every note of the concerto felt like a mountain he had to climb. The tempo was relentless. The scale of the piece, its sweeping phrases, the sheer emotion packed into each section, Ethan could feel himself being consumed by it. But at the same time, there was something exhilarating about the challenge. He wasn't just playing notes anymore. He was living inside the music, feeling the rise and fall of the melody as if it were his own heartbeat. Still, doubts persisted. It wasn't just about the technical aspect of the piece, it was about the emotional depth it demanded. Rachmaninoff's music had a tragic beauty, a yearning that was difficult to capture. And with each passing day, Ethan found himself struggling not only with the music but with his own vulnerability. He wasn't sure if he could do it. Not at the level Mrs. Collins expected. On Thursday, Ethan decided he couldn't keep struggling alone. He needed help. He needed someone who could see what he was missing. And there was only one person he trusted, Maya. Maya was waiting for him outside the music room after school. Her wide smile greeted him as she leaned against the lockers, arms crossed casually. "You look like you've been through a war," she teased, her eyes glinting with mischief. Ethan chuckled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Feels like it." Mrs. Collins assigned Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2. He shook his head, trying to convey the enormity of what she had thrown at him. "Whoa," Maya said, her face softening in concern. "That's a big one, even for you. How are you holding up?" "I'm stuck," Ethan admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's like I can play the notes, but the emotion, the depth of it, it's not coming out the way I know it should. I need help. I don't know how to make it sound the way it's supposed to." Maya smiled warmly, her eyes full of understanding. "Okay, then let's work on it. I know a thing or two about emotions in music. You can't just play the notes. You have to live inside the piece. I'll help you." We'll break it down together. Ethan's shoulders sagged in relief. Maya had always been there for him, through the highs and lows, but now he was seeing her in a new light. She wasn't just a friend, she was a fellow musician, someone who truly understood him. They found an empty practice room and began to go through the piece, section by section. Maya helped Ethan connect the emotions of the music with his movements, helping him understand the longing and despair hidden in the notes. Together, they broke down each passage, allowing the music to breathe in a way that Ethan hadn't been able to before. Hours passed, but Ethan didn't care. They were in their own world, a world where the music was everything, and the struggle was a shared one. Maya encouraged him when he felt stuck and pushed him when he needed it. She reminded him that it wasn't about perfection, it was about expression. And that was something Ethan could give. By the end of their session, Ethan felt different. The music had transformed from a series of notes on a page to a story he could tell with his hands, with his heart. For the first time in days, the weight of Mrs. Collins' expectations felt lighter. Maya had given him the clarity he needed. He wasn't just trying to play the piece perfectly. He was trying to let the piece speak through him. As they packed up their things, Maya gave him a warm hug. "I know you've got this, Ethan. Just trust yourself. Don't try to be perfect. Just feel the music, and the rest will follow." Ethan nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks, Maya. I think I'm ready to face it now." The next day, he walked into the music room with newfound confidence. He was no longer consumed by fear of failure. The challenge still loomed large, but he had something more important now, clarity. He was going to play with feeling, with heart. It wasn't just about proving himself to Mrs. Collins anymore. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever dreamed. As he sat down at the piano, he took a deep breath and began to play the opening notes of Piano Concerto No. 2 once more. This time, it wasn't just his fingers on the keys. It was his soul. And for the first time in days, he felt free. The day of the class performance was finally here, and Ethan couldn't shake the anxiety that had built up inside him. It had been a week since his last practice with Maya, and since then, he'd worked tirelessly to refine the piece. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 was no longer just a mountain to climb, it had become part of him. Yet, the pressure to prove himself had only intensified. Today wasn't just any class, it was a real performance, one that Mrs. Collins had been hyping up for weeks. She had insisted that every student present their progress, a sort of recital, where everyone would be judged. The stakes felt impossibly high. Ethan wasn't the only one feeling the pressure, every student in the class had been working hard, but Ethan knew he had the added weight of proving he belonged there. The piano room felt colder than usual, and the walls echoed with the sound of students practicing their pieces, the low hum of their nervous energy floating through the air. Ethan's palms were slick with sweat, and his stomach twisted into a knot. He tried to calm himself by taking slow, deep breaths, but it was hard to ignore the tightness in his chest. Maya, as always, was there to offer a word of encouragement. She had arrived early to warm up, and when she saw him enter, her face broke into a comforting grin. "You good?" she asked, her voice light but knowing. Ethan forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah. Just nervous. I've been practicing for days, but I still feel like I'm not ready." "You've got this," she reassured him. "Trust me, you've already done the hard part. Now it's just about letting the music speak. Forget about Mrs. Collins for a second. This is your moment, Ethan." Ethan nodded again, though his nerves still gnawed at him. He hadn't yet told Maya about Mrs. Collins' blunt email, that she thought he had a long way to go. But he didn't need to. He already knew what Mrs. Collins expected of him, and the weight of it was almost too much to bear. As students began to gather around the piano, the room grew quieter. Mrs. Collins stood by the front, her arms crossed as she observed the room with a sharp, calculating gaze. Ethan couldn't help but glance at her. Her expression was unreadable, but Ethan felt the pressure of her eyes on him, watching his every move. "All right, let's get started," Mrs. Collins finally said, her voice as commanding as ever. "You all know the drill. Play your piece as you would in a real concert. No second chances. This is your time to shine, or falter." The first student took a seat at the piano, and the room fell into a hush. Ethan watched as the others performed with varying degrees of confidence, but each of them clearly feeling the same nerves that weighed on him. He knew they all wanted to impress Mrs. Collins, but deep down, he felt like this performance was more for himself than anyone else. When it was finally his turn, Ethan stood up, his hands cold despite the warm temperature of the room. His heart raced as he walked to the piano, feeling every pair of eyes on him. Mrs. Collins nodded at him, a silent signal that it was time to begin. Ethan sat at the piano, the familiar, worn keys staring back at him. He adjusted his posture, trying to shake off the tremor in his hands. As he placed his fingers on the keys, he closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about everything that had brought him here, the long nights of practice, the doubt that had crept in, Maya's unwavering belief in him. He could hear her voice in his head, urging him to let go of the pressure, to feel the music. The first notes of Piano Concerto No. 2 rang out, clear and firm. He didn't rush, didn't try to play faster or harder. He let the music unfold naturally, allowing himself to sink into it. The notes were like waves crashing against the shore, powerful yet graceful. His fingers danced across the keys, carrying the weight of the emotion that had been building inside him. As he played, Ethan felt the tension in his chest slowly melt away. He was no longer thinking about Mrs. Collins or the class. He wasn't worried about whether or not he would impress anyone. He was lost in the music, in the story he was telling. Each note was a step, a part of the journey, and it felt like everything around him had faded into the background. When he reached the more intense section of the piece, the tension in the music rose. Ethan's heart raced, but instead of fear, he embraced it. He pushed himself harder, allowing the emotion of the music to take over. His fingers seemed to move on their own, guided by something beyond his control. The piano was no longer just an instrument, it was an extension of him, his voice. And then, as the final notes of the piece echoed through the room, Ethan felt the weight of the performance lift. He had done it. He had played with everything he had. The room was silent for a moment. For a few agonizing seconds, no one said anything. Ethan's hands were still resting on the keys, his breath coming in quick gasps. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his head down, afraid to look up. Finally, Mrs. Collins broke the silence. "Well," she said, her voice carrying the same cool tone as always. "That was surprising." Ethan's stomach dropped. Surprising? Was that good or bad? Mrs. Collins paused, and for a moment, Ethan was afraid she was about to tear him apart. But then she spoke again, her voice softer than usual. "You've clearly worked hard," she said, her eyes studying him with an intensity that made Ethan's heart beat faster. "The emotion was there, Ethan. I saw it. I can't deny that. But," she added, her voice hardening just a little, "there's still room for improvement. You've got the foundation, but you're not quite there yet. Don't get complacent." Ethan nodded, a mix of relief and frustration washing over him. He had done it. He had played with heart. But there was still more to prove. "Good effort," Mrs. Collins said, as if acknowledging the progress he'd made. "But I expect more next time. Don't stop pushing yourself." Ethan stood up from the piano, his hands shaking, but he couldn't help the small smile tugging at his lips. Mrs. Collins had acknowledged his growth, even if it wasn't the praise he had hoped for. It was a start. And that was enough. As he walked back to his seat, Maya caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up. Ethan returned the gesture, his heart still pounding in his chest, but he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be tough, but he was ready. He had proven to himself that he had what it took. And nothing, not Mrs. Collins, not anyone, could take that away from him. The days following the performance felt like a strange limbo for Ethan. The memory of Mrs. Collins' cryptic praise haunted him, "Good effort, but I expect more next time." It was an odd mixture of encouragement and criticism, and as he replayed her words over and over in his mind, he found himself caught between two opposing feelings, pride in his progress, and frustration at the road that still lay ahead. Ethan had worked hard, no question. But Mrs. Collins' expectations weighed on him. She had said he had potential, that the emotion in his playing was there, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Maya had been supportive, of course. She had been his rock throughout the entire process, but she wasn't blind to the pressure Ethan felt. She knew the sting of Mrs. Collins' tough love, even if she tried to hide it. "You'll get there," Maya said every time they met after class, but Ethan could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He knew she didn't want to say the wrong thing. They both wanted him to succeed, but the road to getting there was riddled with obstacles. And then there was the rumor that began to circulate around the school, the one about Mrs. Collins and her new method of teaching. Some students were beginning to question her motives, whispering about how her harsh critiques and impossible standards were driving people away from the music program. There were even murmurs of her favoritism towards certain students, which made Ethan's mind race with doubt. Had she already decided he wasn't good enough? Had he failed in her eyes, despite everything? Ethan kept quiet about the rumors, but they gnawed at him. He didn't know who to trust anymore, and he certainly didn't want to add fuel to the fire by openly questioning Mrs. Collins' methods. After all, she was the one in charge, and he still needed her approval to advance. But something in the back of his mind told him there was more going on than met the eye. That Friday, Mrs. Collins announced a new assignment, one that would push her students even further. The piece she had chosen this time was by Liszt, a composer renowned for his virtuosity and technical difficulty. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat when Mrs. Collins gave him the sheet music. This was going to be even harder than the Rachmaninoff. "Prepare a portion of this for next week's class," she said coolly. "You'll each play it for me, and I expect to see progress from everyone. No exceptions." Ethan glanced at the sheet music. It looked foreign, the notes daunting and complex. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paper, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. "Focus," he told himself. "You can do this." But the uncertainty began to creep in once again. Would Mrs. Collins be satisfied with his playing this time? Could he push himself further than before? Would she even acknowledge his growth, or would he always fall short in her eyes? Later that night, Ethan sat at the piano in his room, the Liszt piece sitting in front of him like a mountain waiting to be climbed. As he began to play, he realized just how much harder this music was compared to anything he had done before. The rhythm was unpredictable, the passages fast and furious. He stumbled over the notes several times, each mistake adding to his mounting frustration. He slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration, the discordant sound echoing through the room. For a moment, he considered giving up. He had always been able to learn fast, to push himself beyond what others expected, but this was different. This piece was testing everything he had learned, pushing him to a place he wasn't sure he could go. What if I'm not good enough? The thought flashed through his mind before he could catch it. Ethan sat still for a moment, his hands resting on the piano keys. The silence in the room felt thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing on his chest. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He needed a break, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to something bigger. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Ethan didn't even have to look up to know who it was. "Maya," he said quietly, standing up and opening the door. She didn't say anything at first. She just stepped inside and looked at the piano, then back at Ethan, her expression softening when she saw the frustration written on his face. "Hey, can I watch you play for a bit?" she asked gently. "I know this piece is tough." I'm here if you need to talk. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He motioned for her to sit on the chair next to the piano, and Maya did so without hesitation. He resumed playing, this time with more focus, but still struggling with the rapid tempo and intricate fingerwork. The notes slipped through his fingers, like water from a broken cup. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Maya said after a few minutes, her voice soft. "You can't expect perfection overnight, Ethan. You've got to be patient with yourself." Ethan stopped playing and turned to face her. His eyes were tired, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I don't know if I can do it, Maya. I just keep messing up," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Collins, she expects so much. It's like I'm never good enough. No matter how much I practice, it feels like I'm still falling short." Maya's gaze softened as she got up and walked over to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Hey, listen to me," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You are good enough. You've come so far. I know it feels like you're not making progress, but you are. You've been pushing yourself beyond your limits. Just remember, you don't have to be perfect. All you need to do is keep moving forward." Ethan looked at her, the frustration beginning to fade, replaced by something else, a quiet resolve. "You're right," he said slowly. "I've been so focused on pleasing her, on getting it right. Maybe I've lost sight of what really matters." He took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the keys once more, his hands more relaxed this time. "It's not about being perfect. It's about learning, about growing. And I can't do that if I'm just stuck in my head, worried about failure." Maya smiled, her eyes lighting up with pride. "Exactly. Now, let's see what you've got. Play it like it's yours, not like you're trying to impress anyone." Ethan nodded and began to play again, this time with a lighter heart, focusing on the music itself rather than the expectations that weighed so heavily on him. For the first time in days, the piano felt like an old friend, one he didn't have to impress. And that made all the difference. The following week, Ethan found himself at a crossroads. He had been practicing the Liszt piece non-stop, but he knew that it wasn't just about memorizing the notes or getting the tempo right. It was about playing with heart, letting the music tell a story only he could express. Mrs. Collins had said that he had potential, but potential meant nothing if he couldn't break free of the chains of self-doubt that held him back. The feedback from the last performance still lingered in his mind. Mrs. Collins had been critical, but she hadn't written him off completely. That, in itself, was progress. Still, as the new assignment loomed, Ethan felt the familiar anxiety creeping back in. He wasn't sure he had the strength to face another harsh critique. But something had shifted after his conversation with Maya. Her words had been a lifeline, a reminder that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about pushing through the tough spots, facing the challenges head-on, and growing along the way. The pressure to impress Mrs. Collins, to meet her impossibly high standards, had clouded his judgment for too long. Now, Ethan was beginning to realize that if he wanted to truly master the piano, he had to stop performing for others' approval and start playing for himself. On the day of the next class, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. When he walked into the piano room, he found Mrs. Collins already standing at the front, her arms crossed and her eyes scanning the sheet music in front of her. The students were whispering among themselves, clearly nervous about the upcoming performance. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, but this time, it wasn't out of fear, it was out of anticipation. He was ready for whatever was coming his way. As Mrs. Collins began to call the students up, Ethan took a deep breath and walked to the piano with more confidence than he had the week before. He had practiced, really practiced, and he was prepared to show it. He wasn't going to worry about whether or not he met her expectations, he was going to play. For the first time in a long while, Ethan was ready to do just that, simply play. Maya gave him a reassuring smile from the corner of the room as he sat down at the piano. She knew how much this meant to him. He nodded at her, then turned his focus to the sheet music. Mrs. Collins gave him a sharp look as he adjusted himself on the bench. "Whenever you're ready," she said, her voice clipped but not unkind. Ethan placed his fingers on the keys and began. The first notes were tentative at first, but as he moved through the piece, he found his confidence building. He no longer worried about whether Mrs. Collins would approve of him. Instead, he focused on the emotions the piece evoked, letting his fingers move fluidly, his body swaying with the music. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was becoming part of the story. The piece was still difficult, there were moments when his fingers stumbled, when the tempo was off, but Ethan didn't let the mistakes derail him. He kept going, embracing the imperfections, letting them guide him forward instead of pulling him back. There was something freeing about it, a sense of release that Ethan hadn't felt before. For the first time, it wasn't about getting it perfect. It was about feeling the music. As the final notes of Liszt's piece rang through the room, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound linger. He felt something shift inside him, a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had done his best. He had put everything he had into the performance, and that was enough. When the music ended, there was a brief silence in the room. Mrs. Collins didn't speak immediately, but Ethan didn't mind. He was content with his performance, regardless of what she thought. After a moment, she finally spoke. "Well," she said slowly, her tone neutral, but not harsh. "That was better." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Better wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was progress. "You've improved," she continued. The emotion was there. "It still needs work, particularly in the more technical sections, but I see a spark in you now. You're not just playing the notes anymore. You're beginning to play with purpose." Ethan felt a surge of relief. Purpose. That was the word that had been missing from his playing all along. He had been so caught up in perfection that he had forgotten why he started playing in the first place, to tell a story, to express himself through music. Maya's face lit up with pride as she caught Ethan's eye. Her smile was enough to tell him that she understood, she had seen the change in him too. As the rest of the class played, Ethan sat back and listened, his mind buzzing with new thoughts. He realized now that Mrs. Collins' words, while tough, had always been meant to push him further. She wasn't trying to break him, she was trying to help him break through his own barriers. It was harsh, yes, but it was also the kind of challenge he needed. The road ahead would still be difficult, but now Ethan felt like he had something to hold on to, the belief that he could do it, and the understanding that he didn't have to be perfect to succeed. When class ended, Maya met him at the door, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You were amazing," she said, giving him a quick hug. "I knew you had it in you." Ethan smiled, the weight of the week lifting off his shoulders. "Thanks. I don't know if it was perfect, but it felt right." Maya grinned. "That's all that matters." As the two of them walked out of the classroom together, Ethan felt lighter than he had in weeks. Mrs. Collins' tough love still stung, but now, it felt like it was only pushing him forward. He wasn't there yet, but he was closer than he had ever been before. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Ethan's performance had earned him something he hadn't expected, Mrs. Collins' respect. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was a start. It was the kind of validation that fueled him to practice even harder, to push through the parts of the Liszt piece that had once felt insurmountable. His fingers were sore from the countless hours at the piano, but there was a fire inside him that kept him going. Maya, as always, was by his side. They spent hours together after school, listening to recordings of the piece, discussing its emotional undertones, and breaking down the technical sections that Ethan still struggled with. For once, Ethan didn't feel alone in this journey. He had someone who understood, not just the pressure of playing, but the weight of the expectations that came with it. "I think you've got it," Maya said one afternoon, her eyes lighting up as Ethan finished a particularly difficult passage. "You just need to get a little more comfortable with the speed. You've got the emotion down, now it's time to tighten up those technical skills." Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow and sat back. "It's so much harder than it looks," he admitted, running his hand through his hair. "I keep making the same mistakes over and over. Sometimes I wonder if I'm ever going to get it right." Maya gave him a sympathetic look, but she was determined. "You will get it right. It's just a matter of time. You're pushing yourself so hard already. The key is to be patient with yourself. Not everything comes at once." Ethan sighed, nodding. Maya was right. The pressure to perform perfectly for Mrs. Collins was consuming him, but that pressure was nothing compared to the fire he felt inside to prove that he could master this music. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Mrs. Collins had praised his progress, but he had seen how she treated the other students. Some of them seemed to be able to play whatever she asked with ease, while others, like Ethan, were left struggling. He knew he wasn't the only one feeling the weight of her harsh expectations. That feeling reached a breaking point the day Mrs. Collins made an announcement that shook the entire class. "This year's music competition is fast approaching," she said, her voice commanding the room's attention. "I'm selecting the most promising student to represent our school, and I expect nothing less than perfection. This is your chance to prove yourselves. If you're chosen, it could be the opportunity of a lifetime." The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been expecting this. The competition was a big deal. The thought of representing the school, of standing on that stage, was both exhilarating and terrifying. As Mrs. Collins continued her speech, Ethan's mind raced. Could he be the one chosen? Was he ready for that kind of pressure? He had been working hard, but was it enough to compete against the others in the class? "You all have a week to show me your best performance," Mrs. Collins continued. "By the end of next week, I will decide who will compete. Don't waste this opportunity." Ethan's stomach churned. 1 week. It didn't seem like nearly enough time. And worse, he could already sense the growing tension among his classmates. Some of them, like Jennifer, already seemed like they were vying for the spot, their performances practically flawless. Others, like Lucas, were still struggling to even get the tempo right. But it wasn't the competition that frightened Ethan the most, it was the fear that he wasn't enough. What if his best wasn't good enough? What if, despite all his hard work, he fell short? That night, he sat at the piano, staring at the sheet music as if it had become his greatest enemy. He knew he needed to step up, but every time he played, the notes seemed to slip away from him, like sand through his fingers. It wasn't just the difficulty of the piece, it was the overwhelming pressure of knowing that this could be the moment that decided his future. Maya arrived at his house the next afternoon, as she always did after school. She found him sitting in front of the piano, staring blankly at the sheet music, his fingers resting motionless on the keys. "Ethan?" she asked softly, walking up to him. "What's going on? You seem off." Ethan shook his head, not sure how to explain what he was feeling. "It's the competition. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can be good enough." Maya sat next to him, her voice gentle but firm. "Ethan, you've been playing your heart out. You've made so much progress already. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to win. You just have to keep doing your best." "But what if it's not enough?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What if I fail? What if I let everyone down?" Maya turned to face him, her eyes full of understanding. "You've already come so far, Ethan. You've pushed through things you never thought you could. If you let this fear control you, you'll never see how far you've really come. I believe in you. And I'm not the only one. Mrs. Collins may be tough, but even she can see how much you've improved." Ethan looked at her, her words sinking in slowly. "She believes in me." It wasn't about being perfect, or about impressing Mrs. Collins, it was about continuing to grow, to face the fear and keep going. He took a deep breath and turned back to the piano. The music was still difficult, the Liszt piece still a mountain to climb, but he no longer felt like it was an impossible task. He would play for himself, for the love of the music. He would give it his all, regardless of the outcome. Maya smiled softly as she watched him play, her eyes filled with pride. "That's the spirit," she whispered to herself. As Ethan continued to play, the tension in his shoulders slowly began to fade. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about winning. It was about pushing through the fear and doing his best, one note at a time. And with that, Ethan knew he had taken the first real step toward mastering the piece. No matter what happened next, he was going to play his heart out. The week leading up to the music competition was a blur of tension, practice, and self-doubt. Ethan spent every spare moment at the piano, playing and replaying the same sections of Liszt's piece. His fingers ached, but his determination burned brighter than ever. The weight of the competition hung over him like a dark cloud, but he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on what he could control, his practice and his growth as a pianist. At school, the atmosphere was palpable. Everyone was talking about the upcoming competition, discussing which pieces they would perform, and strategizing about how to impress Mrs. Collins. Ethan heard the whispers of his classmates, all of whom seemed more confident than he felt. Jennifer, the girl with the flawless technique, seemed ready to dominate. Lucas, the shy kid who had always been one step behind, was visibly more focused than usual, determined to prove himself. Then there was Ethan, who still couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he wasn't good enough, that he would fall short when it mattered the most. One afternoon, as Ethan was leaving school, he spotted Mrs. Collins standing near the front steps, talking to a few of the other students. She was giving them advice, making notes on their performances, and critiquing their progress. As Ethan walked past, he overheard a conversation that made his stomach drop. "I expect you to nail that piece," Mrs. Collins was saying to Jennifer. "You've got the technique. Now it's about showing emotion." Jennifer smiled, her confidence unwavering. "I won't let you down, Mrs. Collins. I've got this." Ethan tried to ignore the pit that formed in his stomach. Jennifer was clearly Mrs. Collins' favorite, and if she was already being praised, then where did that leave him? He wasn't even sure if his emotions were coming through in his performance, let alone his technique. As the days passed, the tension only increased. Ethan had a hard time focusing on anything other than the upcoming performance. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was falling behind, that no matter how hard he worked, it wasn't going to be enough. One afternoon, as he was practicing a particularly difficult section of Liszt's piece, Maya stopped by, as she often did. But today, she noticed that something was different about Ethan. He wasn't playing with the same passion he had been just a few days ago. Instead, his fingers were mechanical, the notes lacking the energy and soul that he had been putting into his practice. "Maya," Ethan said, pausing and rubbing his eyes. "I just can't do this. I've been practicing for hours, but it feels like I'm getting nowhere. I can't get it right, no matter how hard I try." Maya looked at him, concern furrowing her brow. "Hey, don't be so hard on yourself. You've come a long way since the first day you walked into Mrs. Collins' class. You've made huge progress. It's not about perfection, remember? It's about pushing through the rough patches." Ethan sighed, his frustration boiling over. "But what if it's not enough? What if she doesn't think I've improved? What if I'm just wasting my time?" Maya sat down next to him, her voice calm but firm. "Ethan, listen to me. You're not wasting your time. You're growing, and growth isn't always linear. Sometimes it feels like you're stuck in the same place, but that doesn't mean you're not improving. You've got something special inside you, a real gift for music. Mrs. Collins sees that, even if she's tough on you. And I see it too. I've seen the way your playing has changed, the way you're putting more of yourself into the music. But I'm not perfect, Ethan said, his voice cracking. I can't be like Jennifer. I can't play like that. I'm not enough. Maya placed a hand on his shoulder, looking him directly in the eyes. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you. Mrs. Collins isn't looking for perfection. She's looking for something real, something raw. And that's what you have. You're not Jennifer, and that's okay. You're Ethan, and that's more than enough. Ethan looked at her, her words sinking in slowly. He wanted to believe her, but the fear still lingered. How could he stand a chance against Jennifer's flawless technique? How could he possibly compare to the students who were so much more polished than he was? Before he could respond, Maya gave him a soft smile. Trust me, Ethan. You've got this. Just do your best. That's all anyone can ask for. As the days continued to slip by, Ethan struggled to keep his doubts at bay. Every time he sat at the piano, it felt like a battle, not just with the music, but with his own insecurities. He practiced harder, focused more, but still, the nagging feeling of inadequacy wouldn't leave him. The day of the competition arrived, and Ethan's nerves were at an all-time high. The class was gathered in the school's performance hall, each student preparing to give their best rendition of their chosen piece. The room buzzed with tension, and Ethan's hands were clammy as he adjusted the bench at the grand piano. Maya sat in the front row, her eyes full of encouragement, but Ethan could hardly focus on her. His mind was consumed with the thought of Mrs. Collins' expectations. When it was his turn, Ethan walked onto the stage, his heart pounding. Mrs. Collins stood at the side, her arms crossed, watching him closely. As Ethan took his seat at the piano, he glanced at the other students, all waiting for him to begin. There was a flicker of doubt in his mind, could he really do this? With a deep breath, he started the piece. The first few notes were shaky, his hands unsteady, but as the music filled the air, Ethan started to lose himself in it. He focused on the emotion, the story he wanted to tell. Each note felt like it carried the weight of his fears, but also his hopes, his dreams. He wasn't playing for Mrs. Collins. He wasn't playing for anyone except himself. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keys, and for a moment, he felt like he had been transported to another world. The music had taken him somewhere beyond the competition, beyond the classroom, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. As the last note echoed through the hall, Ethan slowly stood up. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew stronger. It wasn't thunderous, but it was genuine. Mrs. Collins was the last to applaud, her gaze thoughtful as she looked at Ethan. She didn't say anything right away, but the look in her eyes was enough. Ethan had given it his all. Ethan's heart was still racing as he walked off the stage. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, and the hum of their whispers filled the air. He hadn't been perfect, but he had given it everything he had. He could only hope that it was enough. As he made his way back to the seats, Maya caught his eye and gave him a small, reassuring smile. Her eyes sparkled with pride, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. He had made it through. He had faced the music, not just the piano, but his own doubts. And now, there was no turning back. He sat next to Maya, trying to calm his racing heart. He could hear the other students' performances unfolding, but his mind was still replaying the piece he had just played. Was it good enough? Was there any chance Mrs. Collins would pick him? When it was finally time for Mrs. Collins to announce who would represent the school in the competition, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. Ethan's palms were slick with sweat, his fingers curled nervously around the armrest of his chair. He tried to steady his breath, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something important, something that could change everything. Mrs. Collins stepped up to the front of the room, her sharp eyes scanning the class. She had the kind of presence that made even the most confident students feel small. Ethan swallowed hard, wondering if his performance had been enough to stand out. "Thank you all for your performances today," Mrs. Collins began, her voice calm and measured. "I know it wasn't easy, and I appreciate the effort each of you put into your work. However, only one of you will be selected to represent our school in the upcoming competition." She paused, letting the words sink in, and Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "As you all know, this is not just a chance to perform. This is an opportunity to prove your abilities, to show the world what you're made of. And I have to say, today's performances were, for the most part, impressive." Ethan held his breath. His hands were still clammy, his thoughts a swirl of uncertainty. "There was one performance, however, that stood out to me," Mrs. Collins continued. "It wasn't the most technically perfect, but it was the most honest. It was raw, and it was full of emotion." Ethan's pulse spiked. Could she be talking about him? It was clear that this student had put their heart into the music. And that, to me, is what matters most. Ethan's stomach dropped, but in that instant, Mrs. Collins looked directly at him. He froze, his eyes wide. Could this be it? Was he really being chosen? Her gaze lingered for just a moment longer before she nodded slightly, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corner of her lips. "That student," she said, "is Ethan Brooks." A stunned silence fell over the room. Ethan blinked, not sure if he had heard her correctly. His classmates were all staring at him in disbelief. It felt like the world had stopped for a moment, as though time had frozen in place. Maya's eyes lit up with pure excitement, and she was the first to break the silence, standing up and clapping wildly. Ethan sat frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Mrs. Collins had chosen him. Of all the students, him. His classmates' applause followed, though it was less enthusiastic than Maya's. Some clapped politely, while others seemed too stunned to react. Jennifer's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Ethan finally stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. He felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him as he walked up to the front of the room. Mrs. Collins handed him a small envelope with the school's seal on it. "Congratulations, Ethan," she said, her tone flat but sincere. "You've earned this. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can do at the competition." Ethan nodded, feeling a rush of mixed emotions. He was proud, scared, excited, and overwhelmed all at once. But above all, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, validation. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore, it was about the journey he had taken to get here. His hard work had paid off. For the first time, he felt like he belonged in this world of music. Maya caught up with him as he made his way back to his seat, her smile wide and full of pride. "You did it. I knew you could do it." Ethan chuckled nervously, still processing everything. "I can't believe it. I didn't think she'd pick me. I mean, I wasn't even the most polished one in the class." Maya shook her head, her expression serious. "That's the thing, though. You don't have to be perfect. You played with heart, and that's what made the difference." Mrs. Collins saw that. Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, and for a moment, he felt like he might tear up. "Thank you, Maya. I don't know what I'd have done without you." Maya smiled softly, her eyes sparkling. "You don't have to thank me. You did the hard work. I just helped you keep going." The announcement was over, but the excitement didn't die down. Ethan's mind was still spinning, and he could barely concentrate on the rest of the class. All he could think about was the competition that was now only a few weeks away. But for the first time in a long time, he felt confident, because this time, he wasn't doing it for Mrs. Collins or anyone else. He was doing it for himself. Later that night, as he sat at the piano again, he played through the Liszt piece one more time. This time, it felt different. The notes were clearer, his fingers more sure. The music no longer felt like a mountain to climb. It felt like something he could conquer, because he already had. And as he played, the sound of the piano filled the empty room, carrying with it a sense of accomplishment and hope that he hadn't felt before. The days leading up to the competition were both a blur and a slow crawl at the same time. Ethan had only a few weeks left to prepare, and the pressure was mounting. He spent hours at the piano, practicing the Liszt piece again and again, trying to get every note just right. But there were still moments when doubt crept in, moments when he wondered if he was really ready. Even though he had been chosen to represent the school, a part of him still didn't feel like he belonged. He was up against some of the best students in the area, students who had been playing piano since they were toddlers, who had the precision and control that he still struggled to find. How could he possibly compete with that? Maya was there every step of the way, helping him navigate the anxiety that was beginning to consume him. She would come over after school and sit in the living room, reading a book or working on her own homework, while Ethan played. Sometimes, they didn't talk at all. Sometimes, they just sat in the quiet, with the only sound being the occasional click of his piano keys. "You're improving," Maya told him one evening, after he finished a particularly difficult section. "I can hear it. You're not just playing the notes anymore. You're playing the music. It's different." Ethan wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his fingers trembling slightly from exhaustion. "I don't know. It still doesn't feel right. It's not enough. Not like Jennifer, or Lucas." Maya looked up from her book, her eyes soft but firm. "Ethan, stop comparing yourself to them. You've come so far. You've got something special, something they can't replicate. You don't need to be like them. You just need to be the best version of yourself." But even with Maya's encouraging words, the anxiety still gnawed at Ethan. Every time he played, he imagined the judges in the audience, watching, scrutinizing. He could see Mrs. Collins' disapproving face if he didn't live up to her expectations. It was as though all the hours he had spent playing and practicing were now weighing heavily on his shoulders, and the fear of failure was louder than the music itself. At school, the competition loomed large in the background. Every conversation seemed to be about it. Jennifer, of course, was the most confident, practically radiating with certainty that she would win. Ethan overheard her talking to some of the other students in the hallway one afternoon. "I'm just hoping I can nail the technical part. I know my emotions are there, but you know Mrs. Collins. She'll be looking for precision," Jennifer said, flipping her hair and glancing at Ethan with a smile that seemed too perfect. Ethan, already feeling small in the shadow of her confidence, looked away, pushing through the crowd without saying a word. Jennifer was right, though. Mrs. Collins would be looking for precision, and Ethan still wasn't sure if he could give her that. The night before the competition, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of how everything could go wrong. What if he messed up? What if he froze on stage? What if the judges didn't like his interpretation? His stomach churned, and his body felt restless. No matter how much he told himself to relax, he couldn't shake the nerves. At around midnight, he slipped out of bed and made his way downstairs to the piano. He wasn't sure why he did it. Maybe it was just to release some of the tension that had built up inside him, or maybe he was trying to prove to himself that he could still do it. He sat at the piano, the dim light from the living room lamp casting a soft glow on the keys. For a few minutes, he just sat there, his hands hovering above the keys, unsure of where to start. Then, he began playing. Slowly at first, but then with more confidence, until the music filled the room. The notes of Liszt's piece rang out in the quiet house, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. He played with more heart than he had in weeks, each note carrying a little more of his soul. The music didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. He played for nearly an hour, losing himself in the rhythm and flow of the music, his hands moving with a freedom he hadn't felt in a long time. By the time he finished, the anxiety had lessened. He wasn't going to be perfect, but he was ready to give it his all. The fear wasn't gone, but it had been replaced with something else, a sense of peace. He could do this. He was doing this. The next morning, the day of the competition, Ethan felt a calmness that surprised him. The familiar nerves were still there, but they were no longer paralyzing. As he prepared to leave the house, Maya showed up at the door, wearing a huge grin. "You ready to show them what you've got?" she asked. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah. I think I am." Maya hugged him tightly before pulling back. "I'll be cheering for you, no matter what. You've already won, Ethan. Don't forget that." Ethan took a deep breath, nodding. "Thanks, Maya." The ride to the competition venue was a blur. Ethan barely remembered the drive. The world outside the car window seemed to move in slow motion. His mind was focused on the one thing that mattered now, the performance. When they arrived at the venue, the atmosphere was electric. The hall was filled with students from other schools, all milling around, practicing their pieces and chatting nervously. Ethan was led backstage, where he saw the other competitors warming up. There was Jennifer, her fingers moving fluidly over the keys as she worked through a complicated passage. Lucas was pacing back and forth, his head down, muttering to himself. Ethan swallowed hard, his nerves returning with a vengeance. But then he reminded himself, he wasn't here to compete with them. He was here to compete with himself. He wasn't trying to be perfect, he was just trying to be his best. After what felt like an eternity, it was finally his turn. Ethan walked out onto the stage, his heart in his throat. The audience was quiet, the judges' eyes fixed on him. He could feel the weight of their gaze, but this time, instead of freezing, he took a deep breath and let the music guide him. The first note rang out, and as the sound of the piano filled the room, all the fear and doubt melted away. For the first time in a long while, Ethan was playing not just with his fingers, but with his heart. The music didn't need to be flawless, it just needed to be real. As the final note echoed through the hall, Ethan sat back, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The performance was over. And he had done it. He had given it his all. The room erupted in applause. The days after Ethan's performance were a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. He had given everything he had, but there was still a lingering question in his mind, was it enough? The competition had been fierce, and while he had played with all his heart, he knew there were others who were just as talented, if not more so. The thought of being judged made his stomach twist with unease. The outcome was out of his hands now. He just had to wait. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day seemed to stretch on forever as Ethan checked his phone multiple times, hoping for any sign of news. The announcement of the winner wasn't supposed to happen until the following week, but each passing day felt like an eternity. In class, he struggled to focus, his mind drifting to the competition and to what might happen. Would Mrs. Collins call him into her office to tell him that he hadn't been selected? Would he be a disappointment to everyone who had believed in him? Maya, however, was her usual steady self. She could see the anxiety building in Ethan, and though she didn't have all the answers, she did her best to keep him grounded. Every time she noticed his mind wandering, she would nudge him or throw a light-hearted comment his way to break his concentration and remind him that no matter the outcome, he had already achieved something remarkable. One afternoon, Maya found Ethan at the piano, his fingers lightly grazing the keys but not really playing. He had a faraway look in his eyes, and his shoulders were tense, as though carrying the weight of the world. "Hey, what's going on in that head of yours?" she asked gently, crossing the room to sit beside him. Ethan sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I don't know, Maya. I feel like I'm stuck in this in-between place. I gave it my all, but what if it wasn't good enough? What if they don't pick me?" Maya smiled softly, nudging him with her shoulder. "You're letting your worries get the best of you. You already showed them what you're made of. You've earned this, Ethan. If you don't win, that doesn't mean you didn't do your best. Ethan shook his head, frustration flickering across his face. But it's not just about me. I want to prove I'm good enough. I don't want to let Mrs. Collins down. She took a chance on me, and I don't want to disappoint her. Maya's expression softened, and she looked at him with understanding. You're not going to disappoint her. You've already made her proud. You've grown so much, Ethan. That's what really matters. You've already won in so many ways. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't thought about it that way. He had been so focused on the competition and the outcome that he had forgotten about the journey. All the hours he had spent practicing, all the times he had doubted himself, all the moments he had shared with friends like Maya, those things meant more than any trophy or certificate ever could. Ethan looked down at the keys, his fingers now moving of their own accord, playing the familiar notes of the piece he had performed. He didn't need to be perfect, he reminded himself. He just needed to be real. He had already given his best, and that was enough. As he played, he felt the tension in his body begin to ease. The music flowed through him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Maya's words had lifted a weight off his shoulders. He wasn't competing against anyone but himself. The next few days passed in a haze. Ethan's mind was still occupied with the competition, but he was trying to focus more on his music and less on the outcome. He spent hours at the piano, playing for the love of the music rather than the fear of failure. He still had moments of doubt, but they no longer controlled him. He had learned to let them pass, like the fleeting shadows they were. Finally, the day of the announcement arrived. Ethan sat at his desk in homeroom, his stomach tied in knots. He couldn't concentrate on anything. The moment he had been dreading, and anticipating, was here. He kept his eyes on his phone, constantly checking the time. The announcement was supposed to be made during the afternoon assembly. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to breathe steadily. He glanced at Maya, who gave him an encouraging smile. She could see how nervous he was, but she knew he was ready, no matter the outcome. The bell rang, signaling the start of the assembly, and Ethan made his way to the auditorium with the rest of his classmates. His heart pounded in his chest, and the air felt thick with anticipation. As he sat down, he glanced around the room. Jennifer was sitting a few rows in front of him, her posture straight, a confident smile playing on her lips. Lucas sat next to her, but his usual calm demeanor was replaced by a tense fidgeting of his hands. Ethan couldn't help but notice that the energy in the room was different today. Everyone seemed on edge. Mrs. Collins stood at the front of the auditorium, her sharp gaze sweeping over the students. The room fell silent, and she cleared her throat. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. "Thank you for your patience over the past few days. Today, I will announce the winner of the piano competition and who will represent our school at the state level. But before I do, I just want to say how proud I am of all of you. Your performances were inspiring, and I'm excited for what the future holds for each of you." Ethan could feel the tension in the air, and he shifted in his seat, trying to still the nervous flutter in his stomach. Mrs. Collins continued, her voice calm yet commanding. The decision was not easy. There were many excellent performances, and choosing a winner was incredibly difficult. But there is one student who stood out to me, not just for their technical skill, but for their passion and emotional depth. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His palms were sweaty. Was this it? Was she about to say his name? Mrs. Collins paused, allowing the suspense to build. "The student who will be representing our school at the competition is Ethan Brooks." The room exploded into applause. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Had he heard her correctly? He stood up slowly, his legs shaky, his mind still reeling. The applause felt distant, almost surreal. As he made his way to the front, the weight of the moment settled in. He was the one. He had done it. Maya was the first to stand and clap, her eyes filled with pride. Ethan couldn't help but grin, his chest swelling with a mixture of disbelief and joy. Mrs. Collins handed him the certificate, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Congratulations, Ethan. I'm looking forward to seeing you shine at the competition." Ethan could barely speak. His throat felt tight, and his heart was racing. He had done it. He had proven himself, not just to Mrs. Collins, not just to his classmates, but to himself. As he walked back to his seat, the applause continued. This wasn't just a victory in the competition. This was a victory in his own life. He had faced his fears, played from his heart, and come out stronger on the other side. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he truly belonged. After the announcement, Ethan was flooded with a mixture of pride and disbelief. He could hardly process what had just happened. As the applause died down, he returned to his seat, trying to ignore the butterflies in his stomach. Maya was smiling ear to ear, her eyes gleaming with pride as she gave him a thumbs up. Ethan could hardly believe it, he was going to the state competition, representing his school. But with this incredible opportunity came an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The rest of the day was a blur. Between the congratulatory messages from friends and teachers, the chatter in the hallways, and the internal whirl of excitement and nerves, Ethan could hardly keep up. By the time the bell rang for the end of school, he was mentally exhausted. But he couldn't afford to relax just yet. He had to prepare for the competition, which was only a few days away. When Ethan got home, he headed straight for the piano. The rush of excitement was beginning to wear off, and in its place was a growing sense of pressure. There were only a few days left before the competition, and he knew he had to keep pushing himself. There was no room for complacency now. He had to be perfect. But that's when the doubt started creeping in again. What if he wasn't good enough? What if, despite all his work, the judges didn't think he was the best choice for the state competition? He couldn't afford to fail now, not after everything he had worked for. Maya arrived at his house later that afternoon, carrying a bag of snacks and her usual positive energy. She immediately noticed the tension in Ethan's posture as he sat at the piano, staring at the keys. "You okay?" she asked, setting down the snacks and walking over to him. Ethan sighed, his hands resting heavily on the piano. "I don't know, Maya. It's just, the closer the competition gets, the more pressure I feel. What if I mess up? What if my performance isn't good enough? I don't know how to shake these thoughts." Maya sat beside him, looking at him with a mix of concern and understanding. "Ethan, you've already proven something. You made it this far, and that's huge. You've come so far from when I first met you. You're a different person now, stronger, more confident. You've got the skills and the heart. And that's what matters." Ethan gave her a tired smile. "I don't know if that's enough. The competition is fierce. Jennifer is so much more technically perfect than me. And Lucas, he's so precise. I'm just, me." Maya gently nudged his shoulder. "Exactly. And that's why you're going to win. Because you're you, Ethan. You've got something they don't. You're not just about perfection, you're about passion. The judges will see that. I know they will." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Maya always had a way of making him feel better, but the doubt still lingered. Over the next few days, Ethan spent every available moment practicing. The pressure felt suffocating, but he refused to stop. Maya continued to visit, offering her unwavering support. She would sit quietly while he practiced, occasionally giving him pointers when he asked for them. Ethan felt the weight of her belief in him, and it pushed him harder than anything else could. The days were long, and the nights even longer. The closer the competition drew, the more Ethan felt like he was balancing on a knife's edge. One mistake, one wrong note, and everything could come crashing down. Every day, he played the Liszt piece over and over, perfecting it. But the more he practiced, the more he realized, it wasn't enough to be technically perfect. It wasn't just about the notes, it was about the feeling. And that was something he couldn't force. It had to come from within. As he sat at the piano, playing the same notes again and again, a realization hit him. He had been so focused on the competition, on winning, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. It wasn't about being perfect or outshining the others. It was about the music. It was about expressing his feelings, his struggles, and his triumphs through the piano. He had to play for himself, not for the judges or for the outcome. That night, Ethan played the Liszt piece once again, but this time, something was different. He let go of the fear, the pressure, the doubts. He played with all his heart, pouring his emotions into every note. The sound was raw, unfiltered, and beautiful. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. When he finished, he sat back, his hands still resting on the keys. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt at peace. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be himself. The morning of the competition arrived, and Ethan felt a strange calmness settle over him. It was as if all the fear and anxiety he had been holding onto had melted away overnight. As he got dressed, he glanced at himself in the mirror, adjusting his tie with a deep breath. Today was the day. He was ready. Maya arrived at his house early that morning to pick him up. She smiled at him when she saw his calm demeanor. "You look different," she said, raising an eyebrow. Ethan chuckled. "I feel different. I'm not so worried anymore." Maya's smile widened. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan. No matter what happens today, you've already come so far. You've grown so much." Ethan nodded. "Thanks, Maya. I really needed to hear that." The ride to the competition venue was quiet, save for the occasional comment or joke between the two of them. When they arrived at the building, Ethan's nerves returned, but not with the same intensity they had before. There was a quiet confidence in him now. He had already done the hard part, he had given his best. As they entered the large auditorium, Ethan's eyes immediately sought out Mrs. Collins. She was standing by the stage, talking to some of the other competitors. When she saw him, she gave him a brief but encouraging smile. He nodded back, feeling a sense of warmth spread through him. Maya leaned in close and whispered, "You've got this." Ethan smiled, his heart full of gratitude for her unwavering support. Today wasn't about winning or losing. It was about sharing his passion with the world. He stepped up to the stage, took a deep breath, and sat down at the piano. The audience was silent. The lights shone down on him, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in time. He began to play. The world seemed to fade away as Ethan's fingers pressed against the keys of the grand piano. For a brief moment, he was no longer in the competition. He wasn't Ethan Brooks, the nervous teenager who had struggled to find his place. He wasn't the boy who doubted his abilities. He wasn't even playing for the judges or the audience. He was simply Ethan, lost in the music, letting the melodies flow through him like they always had when he was alone in his room, playing without fear. The notes of Liszt's Liebestrom filled the air, each sound reverberating through the large auditorium. Ethan's hands danced effortlessly over the keys, bringing life to the delicate passages. The piece built slowly, the tension rising as the music surged forward. It felt different today, freer, more fluid. As he played, he allowed himself to be swept away by the beauty of the music, remembering Maya's words, "It's about passion, not perfection." He let go of the constant self-criticism, embracing the raw emotions that the music stirred within him. The audience sat in rapt attention, their eyes fixed on him, but Ethan didn't notice. His focus was entirely on the piano, on the movement of his fingers, on the rhythm and flow of each note. His heart raced in sync with the rising crescendo. Every emotion he had been bottling up, fear, doubt, hope, poured out in waves through his performance. The middle section of the piece arrived, and with it, a sense of tenderness and vulnerability. The pace slowed, and the music became soft, almost aching. Ethan's fingers caressed the keys gently, as if telling a story of longing and heartache. He was no longer worried about the competition, the judges, or even the outcome. The music was all that mattered. As the final section approached, the intensity returned, the notes quickening, building toward the climactic end. Ethan's entire body leaned into the music, his fingers moving faster, his heart pounding with every note. The room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the music, as if the entire audience was held captive by the power of the performance. When the last note echoed through the hall, the silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's fingers lingered on the keys for a moment, the vibrations still humming in the air. His heart was racing, but it wasn't from nervousness anymore. It was from the sheer exhilaration of the performance. He had given everything. There was nothing left to hold back. And then the applause came. It started softly, almost hesitantly, but quickly grew louder. The audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering, some even rising from their seats to show their appreciation. Ethan's heart swelled with pride, and for a moment, he simply sat there, unable to move, overwhelmed by the support and admiration pouring from the crowd. He slowly stood up, nodding respectfully to the audience, and gave a small, humbled bow. His legs felt weak, but he managed to make his way off the stage, his mind still spinning from the energy of the performance. Maya was waiting for him in the wings, her eyes wide with pride. "You did it, Ethan," she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug before he even had a chance to speak. Ethan laughed, breathless from the performance and the rush of emotions. I can't believe it. I was so nervous, but I just." "You played your heart out," she interrupted. "And it was beautiful. I knew you had it in you." They walked together to the side of the auditorium, where Mrs. Collins stood, her eyes shining with pride. She stepped forward, clapping her hands softly. "Ethan, that was incredible. I'm so proud of you. You truly brought something special to that piece." Ethan beamed, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The weight of the past few days had lifted, and in its place was a sense of accomplishment. He had done his best. He had played for himself, and that was enough. The rest of the competition passed in a blur. Ethan tried to focus on the performances of the other competitors, but his mind kept drifting back to his own experience. He knew it didn't matter what anyone else did. He had already won, not because he was the best or because he would take home a trophy, but because he had found his true self as a musician. And that, in itself, was a victory. When the competition finally ended, the judges called all the participants to the stage for the announcement. Ethan stood among the other competitors, his heart still racing, but his nerves far calmer than they had been earlier. He was no longer worried about the outcome. He had already proven to himself that he was capable, and that was the most important thing. The head judge stepped forward, holding the envelope with the results. The room fell silent. "The winner of this year's state piano competition is," the judge paused, looking out over the crowd. "Ethan Brooks." Ethan felt his heart stop. His breath caught in his throat. His name. He stood there, stunned, as the applause erupted once more. His legs felt like jelly, and he had to steady himself before making his way to the front of the stage. Maya was clapping enthusiastically from the crowd, her face a mixture of shock and pure joy. The judge handed him the trophy, and Ethan could hardly believe it. He stood there, holding the gleaming award, but it didn't feel real. He had done it. He had won. But as he looked out at the audience, he realized something even more important than the trophy: he had found his place. He had found his passion. And no matter what happened next, that was something that could never be taken away from him. As he walked off the stage, Mrs. Collins was waiting for him with a proud smile. "I knew you had it in you," she said. "You've grown so much, Ethan. This is just the beginning." Ethan nodded, his heart full. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins. For believing in me." Maya was there too, her eyes bright with excitement. "I told you. You're amazing." Ethan smiled, holding the trophy in his hands. "This is for all of us. I couldn't have done it without your support." As they made their way out of the auditorium, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The competition, the pressure, the doubts, they were all behind him now. He had proven himself, not just to others, but to himself. And that was enough. Ethan's victory at the state piano competition sent ripples through his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. The trophy he had won sat proudly on the shelf in his room, a symbol of everything he had worked for. But it wasn't the shiny gold trophy that kept him awake at night. It was the realization that he had become someone different. In the days following the competition, Ethan was bombarded with attention. His classmates at school were eager to congratulate him, and the teachers who had once overlooked him now saw him in a new light. Everyone was excited about his achievement, but the more praise he received, the more he began to feel like he was being pulled in different directions. There was a weight to the attention that he hadn't expected, and it wasn't as simple as basking in glory. Maya, as always, was by his side, offering unwavering support. She made sure to keep him grounded, reminding him of how far he had come and how much more he was capable of. "You're not just a winner, Ethan," she told him one afternoon as they sat in the park. "You're a musician now. You've got a gift that goes beyond just competition." Ethan smiled, appreciating the way she always seemed to know the right words to say. But even as he nodded in agreement, doubts began to surface again. It wasn't the trophy that made him question himself, it was the pressure that came with being recognized as the best. What if he couldn't live up to expectations? What if the next performance wasn't as good as the last? One evening, as he sat at his piano, lost in thought, his phone buzzed with a text message from Mrs. Collins. It read, "Ethan, I just wanted to let you know that I've recommended you to the national competition. They're looking for someone with your level of skill and heart. I think you'd be an excellent candidate." His heart skipped a beat. National competition? Was this really happening? For a moment, Ethan sat frozen. The thought of competing on a national stage was both thrilling and terrifying. He had barely had time to process the state competition, let alone think about what it would take to compete at a higher level. But then, a voice inside him reminded him that this was what he had always wanted. It was the opportunity to prove himself, not just to others, but to himself. He had already come so far, and he couldn't stop now. The next morning, Ethan spoke to Maya about it. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "The national competition, it's a huge leap. I don't even know if I'm ready for something like that." Maya raised an eyebrow, her usual optimism shining through. "Are you kidding? You just won the state competition, Ethan. This is your chance to go even further. You have the talent, and now you've got the confidence. You can do this." Ethan hesitated. "But what if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? I've already been lucky enough to get this far. What if this is where it all ends?" Maya reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You don't get to where you are by luck, Ethan. You're not just talented, you've earned every bit of success you've had. The national competition will be tough, but it's not about winning. It's about showing who you are as a musician. That's all anyone can ask of you." Her words, simple yet powerful, made Ethan realize that this wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about continuing his journey, about embracing the challenges and growth that came with each step. Determined to move forward, Ethan agreed to enter the national competition. But as he prepared for the next phase of his musical journey, he couldn't help but think about the lessons he had learned along the way. His mind drifted back to the state competition, and how, when he had walked off that stage with the trophy in hand, the weight of expectation had felt so heavy. But it wasn't the trophy that defined him. It was the way he played. It was the emotion he put into every note, the raw honesty that had made his performance stand out. His next challenge, he realized, wasn't about trying to be perfect. It was about continuing to play with the same authenticity, with the same heart. If he could keep that, everything else would fall into place. But even as he prepared for the national competition, a familiar voice still echoed in his mind. Mrs. Thompson's words, from the very first day of school, rang through his thoughts: a piano can only be as good as the person playing it. That moment seemed so far away now, and yet, it felt like it had prepared him for everything that had come since. With each passing day, as the competition drew nearer, Ethan practiced relentlessly. The hours spent at the piano were no longer driven by fear or pressure, they were driven by a deep love for the music itself. Maya continued to support him, offering her encouragement, but also giving him space when he needed it. She had seen him grow, and now, she watched with pride as he stepped into his future. One day, as Ethan sat at the piano, something clicked. He was playing the same piece again, going through the motions as he had done 1,000 times before. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was feeling them in a way he never had before. The music was no longer something he was trying to perfect, it was something he was living. The emotions poured out of him effortlessly, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of peace. The national competition was just around the corner. Ethan knew the stakes were higher than ever. But more importantly, he had finally realized that this wasn't about the competition at all. It was about expressing himself through the music. It was about finding his voice, his truth. And with that understanding, he was ready for whatever came next. The days leading up to the national piano competition were a blur of practice, anxiety, and anticipation. Ethan had poured every ounce of energy into his preparation, refining his technique, pushing through his self-doubt, and working tirelessly to perfect his performance. But as the day of the competition approached, something unexpected happened. He began to feel the weight of it all. It wasn't the competition itself that unnerved him. Ethan had already proven to himself that he could perform under pressure. But the idea of performing on such a grand scale, against the best pianists from around the country, was daunting. His mind raced with questions: what if he made a mistake? What if he wasn't as good as the others? What if, after everything, he still wasn't good enough? Maya could see the change in him. She knew Ethan well enough by now to recognize when he was struggling with his own fears. One afternoon, just a few days before the competition, she found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "Hey," she said softly, sitting beside him. "You okay?" Ethan didn't immediately respond. His thoughts were tangled, and he wasn't sure how to articulate what he was feeling. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes full of frustration and doubt. "I don't know. I feel scared, Maya. I keep thinking that I don't belong here. I've worked so hard, but what if it's not enough? What if everyone else is better than me?" Maya gave him a long, steady look before speaking. "Ethan, I get it. I really do. But listen, you're not just competing against other people. You're competing against yourself. This isn't about proving you're the best. It's about sharing who you are through the music. And you've got something special that no one else has. It's your story. Your heart." Her words struck Ethan deep. She was right. All along, he had been chasing something outside of himself: recognition, praise, validation. But the truth was, his music had always been about more than that. It had always been about expressing his soul, about finding peace in the chaos, and connecting with the world in a way that words never could. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Maya smiled gently, her eyes full of warmth. "You already have. You've come so far already, Ethan. And no matter what happens at the competition, you've proven something that no one can take away. You've proven that you're not just a good pianist. You're an artist. And that's what matters. Ethan's heart lifted as her words sank in. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, letting the weight of the past few weeks lift off his shoulders. The doubt that had been gnawing at him slowly started to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity. Maya was right. This was his journey, his story. And the only thing he needed to do was stay true to that. The morning of the national competition arrived, and Ethan found himself standing backstage in a large auditorium, surrounded by some of the most talented pianists he had ever seen. He could feel the tension in the air, the electric buzz of anticipation. The competition was fierce, and it was easy to feel small among the giants of the piano world. But as he waited for his turn, something changed inside of him. He remembered everything he had learned in the months leading up to this moment. He thought about the countless hours spent practicing, the ups and downs, the challenges he had overcome. He thought about his family, his friends, and most of all, Maya, who had stood by him through it all. And he realized something: it didn't matter what anyone else was doing. This was his moment, and all he had to do was play with his heart, the way he always had. When his name was called, Ethan stood tall, his heart steady in his chest. He walked confidently to the grand piano in the center of the stage, his mind clear and focused. The lights of the auditorium seemed to blur around him as he sat down at the piano, feeling the cool keys beneath his fingers. The room fell silent. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes closing for a brief moment as he centered himself. He had been here before, his nerves, his fears, they had all melted away during his practice sessions. Now it was time to do the same in front of the audience. He began to play. As the final notes of his piece filled the auditorium, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had given everything, poured every ounce of himself into the performance. And as the last chord lingered in the air, he sat still for a moment, letting the silence speak for itself. The applause that followed was overwhelming, loud and full of admiration. But Ethan didn't hear it. He didn't need to. He knew, deep down, that he had done what he came to do. When he finally stood up and bowed, he felt lighter than he had in years. His heart was full, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried about what would come next. The future was uncertain, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was that he had stayed true to himself. As he left the stage and made his way to the backstage area, Maya was waiting for him, her eyes sparkling with pride. "You did it," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "You were amazing." Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with a sense of accomplishment. "I didn't just do it for the trophy, Maya. I did it for me. And for the music." He could see the pride in her eyes, and it made everything worth it. In that moment, Ethan realized that the journey wasn't about the competitions, the trophies, or the recognition. It was about the music. It was about finding himself in the notes and the silence. It was about telling his story, his truth, one song at a time. And no matter what the future held, that was enough. The weeks following the national competition passed in a whirlwind of emotions and new beginnings for Ethan. He had done more than just play well, he had found his voice. His journey was no longer just about winning, it was about the music, the emotions, the growth. He had learned to embrace both his talents and his vulnerabilities, realizing that each note played was a piece of his own personal story. When the competition results were finally announced, Ethan wasn't holding his breath. It didn't matter to him anymore if he won or lost. The true victory had already been achieved. But when the email came with the subject line "National Piano Competition Results, Ethan Larson, first place," his heart skipped a beat. He had won. At first, the news felt surreal. He had done it. But more than that, he had done it on his terms. He had found his own way to succeed, free from the expectations of others, and free from the doubts that had once held him back. The recognition was overwhelming. Interviews, photo shoots, and offers to perform at prestigious venues poured in. Ethan's world seemed to have exploded into a whirlwind of opportunities, and for a while, he allowed himself to bask in the glory of it all. But even as the applause continued, there was a quiet part of him that kept asking, what now? The answer came to him during one of his quieter moments, sitting alone at the piano in his room. His fingers grazed the keys gently, playing a tune that he had composed himself, a piece full of emotion, a reflection of his journey. As the music filled the room, he understood that his true purpose had never been about performing for crowds or winning competitions. It had always been about creating something real, something meaningful. He thought about Mrs. Thompson, who had once told him that he had a gift for the piano, but that it could only be as good as the person playing it. He thought about Mrs. Collins, who had pushed him to go further than he ever thought possible, and how, in the end, her guidance had opened up a world of opportunity for him. And then, of course, there was Maya, his rock, his constant source of support. Without her, none of this would have been possible. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. Ethan realized that his journey wasn't just about the people who had helped him along the way. It was about the person he had become. The shy, unsure boy who had once doubted his place in the world was now a confident young man, ready to take on whatever came next. He looked out of his bedroom window, the sunlight streaming in, casting a warm glow over everything in sight. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt at peace. The future was still uncertain, but he wasn't afraid. He had learned that it was okay not to have all the answers, that sometimes the beauty of life was in the unknown. And as he played the last note of his piece, Ethan understood that his journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new performances, and new moments of doubt. But he had something now that no one could take away: confidence in his own ability, faith in the power of his music, and the courage to face whatever the future held. That evening, Ethan walked outside and sat on the steps of his porch, his piano award resting beside him. Maya joined him, and for a long while, they simply sat in silence, watching the sky change colors as the sun set behind the horizon. "You're not nervous anymore?" Maya asked, her voice breaking the quiet. Ethan shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No. I think I've finally realized that it's not about being perfect or always winning. It's about sharing what's inside me. That's the only thing that matters." Maya smiled back. "That's the truth, Ethan. You've always had it in you. You just needed to believe it." "I do now," he said softly. "And no matter where I go, no matter what happens next, I'll keep playing for me." As they sat there together, watching the stars begin to twinkle above, Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. He had so much more to offer, so much more to explore in the world of music. The journey ahead might not always be easy, but it would be his, filled with passion, growth, and most importantly, authenticity. The true melody of his life had just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?